So the KP plenary has just started. For the last day and a half nearly, we've been in informal indabas and informal high-level ministerials and high political meetings and various meetings in lots of different halls and rooms, largely without any observers and without civil society. And so this is the first time that parties are now in open plenary. We've just been seeing the text, so this text which has just been tabled and which most of the parties haven't seen at all, and this text is meant to have come from a sense of the indabas, and so now parties will give their reaction to it. I mean, already we're seeing some of the fault lines being exposed. Developing countries have been expressing great concern about the EU proposal for a second commitment period to last 8 years till 2020 because of the lack of ambition in terms of emissions reductions and the fact that developed countries refuse to take action in terms of closing the loopholes. So what we may walk away from Durban in terms of emissions reductions is an incredible situation where developed countries may be able to have a net increase in their emissions because of the loopholes and the low pledges that are tabled rather than a reduction of their emissions. Now that may very well be overcome, and if it is overcome and some of the other issues, and there are many big issues within that, then we may see an agreement on the KP where we see a political statement that looks to a ratification of the Kyoto Protocol next year. The second scenario is maybe that some of the developing countries object to the content of the text and so draw a red line, and in that we may have a collapse of the talks because of the objection of developing countries, and then we'll begin the blame game. Who's to blame? Developed countries for not being ambitious, or developing countries for demanding what they expect the climate convention and the climate talks to have delivered? The third option is we may just talk ourselves into later and actually we get nowhere. And initially there was thought that what may happen is we may see what they call a COP bis, which has happened once before in COP history, which is where the time ran out and the COP ended, but it didn't formally end. And then a period of time later it restarted in another venue and started exactly at that same point. So there wasn't a renegotiation, it was the same documents, but you started at that point. And that's really to factor in when it's impossible for countries to be able to come to an agreement. We've had over 2 weeks of negotiations. Many in the last days have been lasting all night. Many of the negotiators are very tired. Some of the negotiators have already left. Ministers have already left. So there is a sense that everything is on the knife edge here now.
We heard Connie Hedegaard just before this plenary saying that they're holding firm on the idea of closing the ambition gap, and that they're also holding firm on the idea of a legal instrument as opposed to a legal outcome, the bindingness of this treaty. So it sounds like there's still a lot of things that are up in the air right now.
There is a lot of things up in the air, but I think the devil is in the detail, and what's more important, the devil is going to be in the substance. What may happen here in Durban is we may walk away with some shells where we have a Kyoto Protocol in name, where we have a Kyoto Protocol with a commitment to be legally binding and ratifiable, but absolutely nothing inside. And so if we're ratifying and legally binding very little emissions reductions, we're not really going to be on the emissions trajectory. It's not only to keep the planet really at the safer level at 1.5, but overshoot 2 degrees. If the current pledges that are in place now will lead us to a 5-degree world, but by 2020 will put us on a trajectory to at least 3 to 3.5 degree warming, which here in the continent of Africa will mean 5 degrees.
So are there particular countries we should be watching during this plenary? Is it the EU, the US, China, India?
Well, the umbrella countries, all the big developed countries are always interesting to watch. Historically, the United States have been the main blocker of the climate talks and continue to play a very destructive role here in the climate talks. Recently been joined by Canada, who've jumped ship from the Kyoto Protocol, but now we're seeing an increasing stream of rich developed countries. So we've seen both Japan and Russia refuse to put their emissions reductions in the Kyoto Protocol second commitment period. We've seen New Zealand and Australia say that they have to consider, depending on their domestic circumstances, whether they want to put their emissions reductions into the second commitment period of the Kyoto Protocol. So those are the big countries we've got to see. Are they going to be ambitious? Are they going to actually live up to the rhetoric? Or are they going to make sure that we walk away with a weak and ineffective agreement? From the developing country side, the key countries to watch is going to be India. India has really been in the frame here and has been blamed by many countries as a potential blocker. They've come in with very strong positions on the issue around equity, having 800 million people below the poverty line and more poor people than the whole of the continent of Africa. For India, the question of common but differentiated responsibility, historical responsibility, is a critical issue in the climate talks, which puts them in diametric opposition to the rich developed countries who want synergy between the developing countries and developed countries in emissions reductions. So that's one big fight. Obviously, the very totemic countries, Africa Group, because here we're in the African continent. Africa Group has been under an incredible amount of pressure from developed countries to weaken its ambitious position that it came into the Climate Convention with. In September, 52 of the African countries met and agreed a declaration, the Bamako Declaration, which set out what their negotiating position would be. A minimum of 40% emissions reductions by 2017, keeping temperatures well below 1.5, climate finance, no World Bank, and the Green Climate Fund being under the auspices of the UNFCCC. They may walk away with absolutely not one single item that they came in here with. So that's going to be very interesting, and it'll be very interesting as to see what sort of pressure, who breaks within the Africa Group, how strong they remain. The small island states and the vulnerable countries have always spoken very passionately and powerfully about the need for urgency. So it will be interesting how they react if there is stalemate here. Will they be looking to point their fire at the big developed countries, or will they also join the chorus and attack India?
What are the odds that all these complex legal issues can get thrashed out in a plenary situation?
Zero. They're not going to get thrashed out here. I mean, at the best, we're going to get some paper agreement. It's absolutely impossible to think that those complex issues are going to be agreed in a plenary when you've got texts. The LCA deck document in itself, which was a massive document, was about a centimetre thick earlier today, and we've not seen much change in the LCA document, and we've seen lots and lots of different positions within it, but very, very weak. I mean, I think what we're going to see, unfortunately, is a very weak outcome here in Durban.
So that said, why are we still here even watching?
Because the role of civil society, the role of all of us, is to constantly campaign for more ambition, to hold our governments accountable, to be able to tell the world tomorrow who was responsible, who needs to be in the firing line in terms of our public hire, but who needs to be pressured, who needs to be brought to the table and make sure that they commit meaningful emissions reductions. Many people, for example, have claimed that the European Union is the hero in these climate talks, and sometimes the European Union gets off very lightly. I think the challenge for us as Europeans is to go back to Europe and make sure that we deliver genuine, real emissions reductions. At the moment, the EU has come in with a 20% emissions reduction target, which has already been met because of the economic crisis. It's come in with massive loopholes because of LULUCF, the hot air, and the offsets. None of those have been closed. So that's our challenge, to make sure that the rhetoric of tackling climate change is demonstrated in our national and our European capitals, and that we use the climate crisis and the financial crisis to have the transformation of our economy to a lower carbon, more sustainable economy, which brings both green jobs, a healthier economy, and brings a more just solution to tackling the climate crisis globally.
Thanks, Asad.